So, if you ever get the chance to look at a vintage clothing catalog, you'll notice that the most common fabric for just plain white blouses to be made out of was rayon crepe. Because of the versatility of these basic blouses, like they could be worn for decades after they were made because they're so basic, not many exist in vintage clothing shops or online. And so for the past few years, I've been making sure to look out for plain white rayon fabric. Rayon isn't as common of a fabric as it used to be, especially rayon crepe, which is usually only sold with prints on it. And so I was so excited when I found this plain white rayon challis online from a deadstock fabric store. Even though it isn't crepe, I figured it was the closest I was going to get for a long time to a more historically accurate 1940s blouse. Because this fabric was so soft and smooth, I wanted to make a long sleeve blouse out of it, and so I chose this pattern for my collection, McCall 4854 from 1942. This is actually my very first vintage sewing pattern, and I used it to make my first vintage sewing project and I think my third sewing project overall. And so, since my sewing skills were not up to par when I made this blouse, I figured that it was high time for me to make it again. If you'll notice, on the long sleeve blouse, there are 3 small darts in the arm to create a very square shoulder, which is expected for 1942. The darts in the sleeve are kind of a remnant of earlier in the decade and in the very late 1930s, where puffed sleeves and other sort of darted sleeves were common, but the squareness of it is reflective of the middle of the decade, when shoulders were padded and at their most square. Throughout the 1940s and into the 1950s, pattern companies were starting to transition from patterns cut out of tissue with small perforations in them to indicate different things for sewing, and printed patterns, which you still see today, that are printed with ink telling you exactly what each part is for. This pattern happens to be a printed pattern. My favorite patterns to work with are the ones in the transitionary period that have both perforations and printed lines, because the perforations make it easier to transfer marks from the original pattern to your fabric. Unlike today, where sewing patterns are printed on large sheets of tissue that you have to cut out yourself, in this period the patterns were already cut for you, but there was a small allowance on the outside that you had to cut off yourself as you cut out the fabric. Because I bought this pattern used, it already had the margin cut away from it, but you can see on the shoulder pad pattern, which the original owner did not use, the original margin is still there. As to not damage the original, I worked instead with tracings of the pattern that I made several years ago that include all of the necessary information just traced onto a roll of doctor's office paper and cut out. When I was cutting the sleeve piece, I added some extra height to the bottom of the arm's eye to mimic what sewing in a gusset into the sleeve would do, just to give some more mobility into the arm. I wanted to do a different style of sleeve cuff than on the original pattern, so I lengthened that piece by a few inches and shortened the sleeve pattern by about an inch. I actually learned some pretty interesting facts about the history of sewing patterns lately. So, home sewing wasn't as common historically as a lot of people think it is. Like, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the majority of people, regardless of class, went out and bought fabric and then gave it to a dressmaker who would make it into whatever garments they needed. Of course, some people made their more simple garments at home, but because dressmaking was so specialized and fabric was so expensive that it was kind of important that you got it right the first time, the majority of people did not make their clothing at home. Though some articles were store-bought, most clothing was custom-made until around the Victorian period. Industrial techniques allowed for some clothing to become ready-made. It was also in the late 1800s that commercial sewing patterns started to enter the market, and they definitely increased in popularity into the 20th century when people started making more of their own clothes at home. The idea of girls being educated in sewing and making clothes in school was also a Victorian thing and helped home dressmaking become more common. And I got that information from the book Making Working Women's Costume by Elizabeth Friendship, which is a book of basic patterns for working class clothing between the 14th and 20th centuries. And I marked the darts on the sleeve in a disappearing ink pen. I have an awl that I use to poke small holes in my patterns so that I can treat them as perforated patterns and just trace straight through onto the fabric. By the time I got around to sewing it, these lines did fade a little bit, so that's the one annoying thing about the disappearing ink. Sometimes it disappears before you're ready. Then I transferred all of the notches from the pattern to my fabric. And this is the large shoulder dart on the center front. So the first step on the pattern was make dart in front sections, make pleats in back on lines indicated and based, sew yoke 2 front and back sections making lapped seams. I went a little bit out of order on some of the steps in this pattern, but for the most part I followed the instructions. But the first step is always darts. Since the lower half of the back under the yoke has a little bit of fullness in it to allow a greater range of movement, I tucked that fullness into 3 little tucks on each side so that it would fit onto the yoke. I have to say, working with commercial sewing patterns is so nice because if I made this pattern myself, I wouldn't have put guidelines for myself and I would have just had to measure and work it out as I was sewing, so it was so nice how I just had guidelines to follow. Then I sewed the dart, and while I was at the machine, I also basted those tucks into place so that I could take out the pins and it would lay more flat as I attached the yoke. And then, in order to make the lapped seam, I folded down the seam allowance of the yoke and basted that into place. To sew the lap seam, all I'm doing is laying the two pieces together and then I'll top stitch along the yoke to secure it. While I was at the machine, I also proceeded to the next step and sewed the underarm seams. And then I did the same lapped seam to join the yoke to the front of the blouse. I ignored the instructions for putting the patch pocket on the front of the blouse. The next step was to turn collar on line indicated, right sides together, and join side edges, then turn right side out. This little seam at the top of the lapel also needed to be sewn. Then I could insert the collar into the neckline, sewing one side of the collar to the small amount of facing that's folded back on either side of the front, and the other side of the collar to the neckline edge. I hope that makes sense. Basically, I'm just trying to insert the collar into the seam, while making sure it looks neat on the part of the seam that's exposed when the lapel hangs open. If this makes more sense, the instructions says, sew one edge of collar to neckline and other edge to front facings, then turn facings right side out, making buttonholes in right front, see following details. However, I decided to make the buttonholes later, and so I proceeded onto the sleeves. So this little rectangle of fabric was basted to the sleeve and then stitched around. Don't mind the first line of stitching that I did and tore out. For some reason, I didn't think I had to do it neatly, then I realized I did because that's the line that I would have to turn it on. So I just cut the slit in the sleeve open along that line and folded the facing to the inside. Then I worked on the cuff itself, sewing these two rectangles of fabric in half to finish the edges. While I was at my machine, I also sewed the sleeve seam. Then I added gathering threads all around the lower edge so that the sleeve can gather into the cuff. Of course, I made 2 rows of gathering so that it would lay a bit neater. Then I put 2 buttonholes into each cuff so that they could be closed with cuff links later on. Here I'm just gathering the lower edge and pinning it to one side of the cuff. Then that's just sewn into place, and the other edge of the cuff is turned and felled to hide the raw edge. I actually really enjoyed this part of the process because it's something that you don't get to do on every sewing project, and it demanded a certain level of neat sewing and precision. Oh yeah, I forgot to say, while the sleeve was still flat, I also sewed the darts in the sleeve cap. Between the darts and the extra height I added at the underarm seam, the sleeve was a little bit small to fit into the armhole, but I don't think it's noticeable at all on the finished product, and the fact that it was like that did make it easier to set than if there had been extra volume in the sleeve cap as you're supposed to have. I do not know where the footage went for putting the buttonholes into the blouse, but now that the rest of the blouse was pretty much done, I was ready to sew on buttons. I also don't know where the footage went for hemming the bottom of the blouse. It was basically just a double fold hem. You're not really missing anything. Just for a little bit of added color, I decided to use green thread to sew on the buttons. It's very subtle on the final product, but I really like the small touch. I also made cufflinks out of buttons as well, following the pattern's instructions. These are vintage buttons that I bought at an antique sale, and I just used a darker green thread and passed it a few times between the buttons in order to create a stem connecting them, and then I did a buttonhole stitch all along that line of thread. And this is how they ended up looking. So, this is how the blouse ended up turning out. The whole time I was debating on whether to put shoulder pads into it or not, and in the end I decided not to because the fabric was very thin and I thought maybe you'd be able to see them inside the blouse and that would not have been good. It's a tad bit large on me, which I don't really mind because I wanted a very elegant and flowy blouse to begin with, but the fact that I didn't put in shoulder pads means that the edge of the shoulder is a tiny bit limp. Overall, I'm really happy with how this pattern inserted the collar into the seam. One side looks a little bit messy, but the other side looks really clean. The only complaint I have is that the opening to the cuff on the sleeve was supposed to go on the other side of the arm. Basically, I sewed the left sleeve onto the right arm and the right sleeve onto the left arm. I thought I was doing it right, but apparently not. I could always fix it at a later date, but I really don't want to reset both of the sleeves. Here you can see the green thread that I used to sew on the buttons. I think it's a really nice touch. Overall, I'm really happy with how this blouse came out. The rayon challis makes the blouse feel very professional, and it really does feel like a high quality garment. I feel like I've said this for so many videos, but you can see my sad attempt at Veronica Lake waves in my hair. I just can't get these large loose curls to dry overnight. It does kind of look like her naturally wavy hair though, and the skirt that I'm wearing is true vintage from the 1940s. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe. In the very near future, I'm going to be making an entire Regency ensemble, so make sure to stick around to watch that. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.